Anthropologies of religion do not always address the oppression to communities that their use of the concept religion entails. First Nations in Canada hardly feel like the word is representative of their ways of life. Hence, on documents, religion is understood to mean from the great traditions, especially Christianity, an arm of colonialism. Dominique Leblanc, an Algonquin Canadian, belongs to the Wolf Clan and the Eagle First Nation Quebec Reservation, just past the Quebec border. She grew up in Toronto and began learning about her Indigenous identity at the age of 10. Her individual experience depicts how, since the 20th century, First Nation identity has become a highly multifaceted and varied experience of being defined by Western, Christian, and ancestral forces. The community of First Nations today works to encourage Native status holders to maintain the life and integrity of their teachings through the process of remembering and discovering. Crucial to these teachings and to all studies of these people is the history of the seizure and degradation of their land by colonial powers, genocide via war, slavery, rape, disease, mass famine, and removing Native children from families and communities. Colonizers aimed at disorganizing and confusing their established social institutions and identities, and developed government policies which aimed at alienating and eradicating Native identity through coerced land agreements and residential schools. First Peoples were placed in reservations or foster homes, left with the horrific memory of generations of peoples subjected to Western erasure. Dominique's relationship to her community began at the age of 10, when she got to know her mother again. Her aunt on her father's side began to explore her First Nation heritage recently, after finding lineage and then community acceptance. Her father and lifetime caregiver was raised a Catholic as a teen in Quebec. With her status, she may claim land when she turns 16, as stipulated by the Canadian government. Luckily, she was also taught the true history of First Nations in Ontario Public High School. Dominique Leblanc is a U of T student who focused on topics of colonialism in Canada, First Nation genocides, and legal conflicts in high school and her first year, as well as First Nation spiritual philosophy, ceremonial practices, and their central teachings. Dominique's knowledge of residential schools and First Nation ceremonies began when she was living with her mother for about a year in a First Nation transition home, where her mother began to explain her own story of abuse and trauma. Her mother, Cynthia, grew up in Mattawa, raised by a Catholic guardian, for her mother was too young and traumatized to care for her. Cynthia spent her summers on the reserve, where she was exposed to more of her community that rarely practiced or held ceremonies. For trauma from residential schools and Christian interventions on reserve caused confusion with faith and made these too difficult, traumatic, or confusing. Every summer, she experienced abuse from her traumatized family. Cynthia left this life, journeying to BC on her own at the age of 13. She deepened her knowledge as she sought healing medicines in cities with community centers and housing for First Peoples, such as Vancouver, Toronto, and Peterborough. For substance abuse is a common outcome of intergenerational trauma and reservation life. This discovery of one's inherited faith is crucial to the traumatized First Peoples. Some First Peoples not born into healthy First Nation communities have given up their Native identities altogether, either for Christian ones or due to substance abuse or distractions of the Western ways in and off reservation that systematically suppress the First Nation ways of life. To this day, First Nations still lack agency and adequate resources to control what happens on their land. The TRC has not been satisfied, and their freedoms of religion continue to be breached by Keystone pipelines and water adversaries and other land development projects. In remembering and discovering their oral traditions and spiritual practices, First Nations grieve their integrity and adapt themselves to the imposed Western ways of life. Pre-contact First Peoples organized into complex self-governing nations, relying on ever-changing yet pervasive teachings of all that surrounded them. Dominique was given knowledge of her first spirit name at the age of 11 by a chief member at Anishinaabe Health Toronto, a naming ceremony for which you may revisit later in life as your spirit changes. The chief elder told her that in his vision he saw her spirit as one of a monarch butterfly, being chased by a wasp. At 16, she decided to get a tattoo of what she hopes to learn from this vision, which is not to run from her problems, but to have courage and face them. She also participated in a sweat lodge and learned of many other rituals and practices through her mother's passing down of oral histories, such as the Sundance, who Cynthia's friend participated in 3 separate times, a show of immense courage, for the goal of bettering her community members' poor health. Western adjectives and nouns such as primitive, native, crude societies, aboriginal, promiscuous horde, noble savage, and indigenous, among others, are used in the influential ancient and modern anthropologies to refer to so-called lower races, societies deemed debasing by the colonial imposition and imperial ideal. Scholars widely studied at the elementary level by religion students such as Emil Durkheim and E.B. Tyler, whose disciplinary specialized silos and breakthrough methodologies support their own assumptions and are driven and endorsed by a competitive field of intellectual discovery. Durkheim, like many anthropologists of religion, proposed an origin of religion in order to track the development of the great religions. He argued that totemism was the elementary religion practiced by Aboriginals of Australia and American tribes, but many argue it is not a religion. His definition of religion relies heavily upon Christianity. Thus, for every time the word religion is used in elementary forms of religious life, it does not include so-called primitive religions. In his synthesis, he implies that so-called primitive societies have stagnated in time, for lack of living as the nations of the great religions. He refers to them as a crude and confused religion. When searching Webster's dictionary for the term crude, we find its first definition: a being found in nature and not altered by processing or refining, with synonyms including native, raw, rude, undressed, untreated, and unrefined. Its second definition, belonging to or characteristic of an early level of skill or development, with synonyms low, rude, primitive, rudimentary, and its near antonyms, sophisticated, contemporary, and civilized, and its third definition, depicting or referring to sexual matters in a way that is unacceptable in polite society, whose synonyms include dirty, impure, and profane, with related words undesirable, reprehensible, and debasing. Its fourth definition, lacking in refinement or good taste. These terms place societies living on opposite sides of the globe under an umbrella type of primitive religion that enables the futile anthropogeny of religion, which degrades an entire type of socioeconomic cultural system, and places First Nation people as the lowest class in our imperial socioeconomic system. Maswaza via Oris explained this issue perfectly. In the 16th through the 19th centuries, the conventional assertion that Christianity was the globe's once future and only true religion, and that all other religions were perversions, degradations, inversions, or anticipations of it, was transformed but not fundamentally changed by the early 20th century discourse of world religions, which celebrated a universal and essential something called religion that was really a mass version of supersessionist Christianity, into the later 20th century academic field of religious studies, which has turned that crypto-Christian something into the object of critical scrutiny, indeed, into the foundation of an entire academic enterprise, while masking the enduring impress on it of Christian supremacy and domination. Dominique has basic understanding of her First Nation identity. She embodies her knowledge of the teachings of the 7 main clans, now becoming a moral code for how to treat others and yourself rather than how to live in harmony with nature. This process of learning is not routine for Dominique. As living in the city, she succumbs to the distracting forces around her, the pressures to work and study and keep in check with her parents' health. Her mother is also in the growing process of healing and faces similar distractions, but has found new connections with her land while moving to a small town in BC. She smudges when she feels it necessary to cleanse her environment and self, and has performed the short ceremony for me. This Christian issue in the silos of anthropology that I have outlined is likely one of the reasons why Indigenous studies emerged as its own silos. Yet, what is being done of the existing work studied globally by anthropology students? First Nation traditions, as adapted to Western traditions, are not understood and lack sources and direction to progressive research and emphasis or mention on the issue of derogatory and Christian terminology. What is the purpose of still teaching Durkheim's definitions of religion and theories when they have been proven to be non-inclusive and derogatory? Jane Elder calls for a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary understanding of the study of Indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere in anthropology. Elder calls researchers to ask themselves what preconceived notions were held by those writing for the historic record, and to develop a keen sense of the worldviews of the observers as well as those they observe.